Now, in this session, we're going to talk about the transportation allotment, and it's done completely differently from the ones that you've just been seeing in the earlier sessions. And there's no adjusted allotment that's taken into consideration. It has to do with the amount per mile and the number of students that are riding. So let's look at the transportation. Now, some key points. This transportation funding is for basic transportation when you go out and you pick up a child at their home and you bring them to school, and then in the afternoon you take them back to their home. It's not for extracurricular activities and field trips and things of that nature, although you can have other transportation costs that are allowable. For example, if you had 2 junior highs, and on one junior high you had a special vocational class or something that you didn't have on the first campus. And so in the middle of the day, you took those kids from this campus over here where they didn't have that class and took them on a bus over to the other campus and then back. That mileage would count towards this transportation funding, as well as area vocational schools and a few things like that. Now, the limit is that it's for students who are at least 2 miles from their school, which is a kind of an interesting situation where you might have 2 kids in a household, and the high school kid may be more than 2 miles from his campus, but the elementary student might be a mile and a half from his campus, and so one's eligible and the other isn't. But you could go ahead and pick them up. You just wouldn't get funding based on the one that was within 2 miles. Now, the school board can designate certain locations within that 2 miles as being hazardous traffic areas, and there's a limit of the funding that you can get. I believe it's 10% is the maximum you can use there, but there are instances where the school board can say, when we pick up the kids in this area, it's pretty dangerous, and so you need to go pick them up, and the state will fund that. And also for some handicapping conditions as well that might apply. Now, at the end of every school year, the districts submit 2 reports. One of them is a Transportation Route Services report, and this is kind of the primary source for determining your ridership and your rate per mile that you're reimbursed on. And it takes the mileage and it takes the ridership for that particular year. And we'll go through the process of what happens after that. At the same time, another report is the Student Transportation Operations Report, and it's really all of your travel, including the extracurricular, and you total up all of your costs, and you total up all of your miles, and you divide that out to get what all transportation costs you in that district for that year. Now, those are done at the end of the year and have nothing to do with the funding for that ending school year. It's for the next school year that it's applied. And the key thing about this second report, the Student Transportation Operations Report, there are 2 things. One, it tells you what costs actually are. And the second is that it is a cap. You cannot get more based upon your rate per mile that's determined under this process I'm going to show you. You cannot get more than what your actual cost is. But what we're reimbursed for is so low that that doesn't apply to anybody. So it basically comes back to your funding comes from the Transportation Route Services report. Now, all you have to do is count kids for 2 trips. You can count them, you can pick out 2 times. You can say, okay, we're going to count kids on October the 3rd, and we're going to count them again on March 15th. 1 trip. And it's just 2 times. It cannot be in the same month. It must be in different months, but other than that, it can just be any 2 days. You could say September the 3rd and October the 1st. 2 different months, 2 days. You could say the morning route here, the afternoon route here. You just have to have 2. And then you average those together, and that's your rider count. Now, you don't have to do that just by picking it at the beginning of the year. at random, or even if you think you're going to have higher ridership in those particular months. What you can do is you can count the kids every day. And then at the end of the year, before you submit your report, you know what the count was on all of those days, and you can pick out the two that are the highest and average them together for your ridership count. The only thing is those 2 days have to be in different months. And then you take that daily average there based on those 2 days, and then you multiply by 180 to make it an annual number, to annualize your counts. And that is the number of kids that you're credited with carry-in. All right, so the numerator here is a 2-day count, different months. You take the average of those 2 days, add them together, divide by 2, multiply by 180 to make them annualized, and then you divide by the annual number of miles on your approved routes. And that gives you the effective linear density number. And most time you'll hear your people talk about linear density. They won't talk about effective linear density, but there's only one. So you'll know what they're talking about. So remember, it's based on previous year's report, and here's an example. We're going to work through it. Let's say that the 2 best days that you've chosen, whether you just did it on those 2 days, but let's just say that the best you had was on 195 and 205, and I chose those because they average out to be a cool 200. Easy for multiplication. You multiply always by 180. Doesn't matter how many days you go to school, you still multiply by 180. That's your annualized ridership. So you take your 200 that you just averaged up here, and you multiply by 180, and that gives you, for the year, 36,000 riders in this example. So let's suppose that you travel on your routes, your approved routes, so you travel 60,000 miles. You take the 36,000 children divided by the miles traveled, and you come out with something that looks like 0.6. In this case, it's 0.6. It could be 1 point something. It can be actually, if you're a very condensed area where you can't pick up a lot of kids in a few miles, then this 0.6 would be higher. If the more sparse you are, the lower that number would be. But that is your linear density. And I added a 0 on the back of it, which doesn't change the value, but it makes it easier for the chart that I'm about to show you. So once you have your effective linear density, you apply it to this table. This table has not been changed since 1984. And the cost of traveling down the road is a little bit different. You're paying more money. Buses now are costing 3 times what they did back then. And gasoline, although it currently is a little lower than what it has been, it's nowhere near what it was in 1984. So over here on the left are your linear density groups. And if your linear density is up to and including 0.399, then you get 68 cents a mile. That's what pays for your transportation. Well, considering that the federal government allows, I believe right now the rate is 56.5 cents per mile for as being the cost for tax purposes when you're driving on business down the road in a car, not a $100,000 bus, and not on the kind of mileage you would get in a big bus, and with a chauffeur, you're going to have 11.5 cents more for all of that. So obviously this number is way too low, as they all are. They haven't been raised since 1984. Now, the most condensed situation, you might have a linear density number of 2.4 or above, in which case then you would get $100.43 per mile for your route mileage. And there are 7 different, I think that's 7, 3, that's 7 different categories of linear density. And there's been various solutions suggested. These rates deliver less than a third of the actual cost because it hasn't been increased. The only way that anybody's transportation allotment goes up is if their density, their ridership changes, or if the miles that add a route or lose a route. But there's some have suggested dropping off those bottom 2s because you don't really need that many different categories, and that would help raise the bottom. But these guys up here in the more condensed areas, they're going to need more money too. They're not working on 1984 prices either. So there's your 0.79 is what you get. That's your effective rate per mile for the regular program, your transportation allotment. Now, the assigned allotment per mile rate for the school year is determined using your district's preceding school year's effective linear density and cost per mile. And in our example, that was 79 cents. And so that's what this district would have all of theirs provided, which won't provide probably a third or less of the actual cost, but only then if that number exceeds what your actual cost per mile, and I guarantee you it'll be above 79 cents. And that concludes this session.